You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 1st of July 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Ukraine draws closer to Europe as Russia claims to have drawn parts of Ukraine closer to Russia. Denmark puts its women in conscript uniforms as well, and is thinking you've won the lottery worse than not winning it. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Aliona, Hlivco and James Rodgers will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the author Ben Coates about his new book about Amsterdam, the city he adopted, and vice versa. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Aliona Hlivco, founder and CEO at St James's Foreign Policy Group and a member of the Advisory Council at the Coalition for Global Prosperity, in fact. And by James Rodgers, Associate Professor of International Journalism at City University of London. Hello to you both.
Hi, Andrew.
Hello.
Aliona, first of all, last time I saw you, actually, I was going to say we were both in Odessa. That is not actually strictly true because I happened to bump into you on the street in London just yesterday.
There you go.
Exactly. But we were in Odessa, and since then also in London. As I understand it, you have managed to have a conversation of some sort with your country's president.
Yes, President Zelensky was in London last Monday, and that was a much-needed meeting for him with Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister here. Besides aligning on some objectives at the upcoming NATO summit that happened 2 days later, the very important decision on joint drone production was signed between the UK and Ukraine. So that's quite exciting to say the least, given the times we live in. The drones now must excite us. But the long-range capabilities are crucial for Ukraine, and it's important that the UK, as a great supporter of Ukraine, also gets a stake in that.
We will be talking more about Ukraine shortly, and I suspect, James, over coming weeks and months, we're going to be talking more about your book, which you finished.
I have finished,
and just to be clear, listeners, we don't mean that he's finished reading one. You finished writing one.
I have finished writing one, and it's going to be out in January. And it's about it's a political history of Russia and its relations with the West from 1991 to 2022.
Okay, so that's going to be a barrel of chuckles.
I've tried to put a couple of jokes in it, but I've struggled to do so, honestly, because mostly it's a serious and certainly towards the end a very sad story, unfortunately. So I've just been trying to answer the question for my generation of Europeans as to what went wrong, really.
Well, many congratulations, seriously, because getting to the end of writing any sort of book is no small undertaking, and it is. Have you got to that glorious moment where you have sent off the absolute last and final edits and are able to think, I don't ever have to think about that thing again as long as I live? I've
done the second and final draft, and it's going to copy editing now, so I'm sure that I don't like to say this, but I was looking at the manuscript today and I found a repetition, which is slightly nagging. But anyway, I'm putting that to the back of my mind. Is still in the afterglow of having sent the whole thing in last week.
Well, we will remind listeners of its availability as we draw closer to it. But first, we will hear, and I should say we will hear more from both of you very shortly. But first, we are going to Canada, where it is Canada Day, and happy Canada Day, Canada. This Canada Day also has a political resonance, as it is the date by which new Prime Minister Mark Carney promised that by way of countering the tariffs imposed across Canada's border with the United States, he would eliminate all of Canada's internal trade barriers. Well, joining me with more on this is Monocle's man in Toronto, Thomas Lewis. Thomas, the big, not to say obvious question first, has he in fact done it?
Well, it's a yes, Andrew, but yes with caveats. I think it's fair to put it that way. A big bill was passed into law on the 26th of June last week, and that basically eliminated, in principle anyway, all federal restrictions on interprovincial trade. Now, for many, many years, kind of the idea of bringing down barriers between Canada's provinces when it comes to trading between one province and the next has been a sort of a bit of an academic exercise, I think it's fair to say. So the fact that a lot of this is happening so quickly, and many of the provinces themselves have taken it upon themselves to do their own trade deals with neighbouring provinces like British Columbia and Alberta recently signed a deal on wine, for example. Atlantic Canada is looking at doing a free trade zone between all of those provinces on Canada's Atlantic coast. So these things really are moving. I think, when you listen to the experts who've been, obviously the Canadian press has been looking at whether Mark Carney has kept to his promise, given how much of an anchor that slogan was during his campaign, during the election campaign back in the spring. It's been described as sort of a starting point, if you like, that on paper he's managed to do it in this law, but actually the provinces will wield a lot of power here, and those processes are still getting underway. But I will say that the appetite to really boost interprovincial trade has not gone away at all. So it does feel like an exciting time for lots of producers in lots of parts of the country, Andrew.
And Thomas, despite that partial to near complete success, he is nevertheless being gloated at today from behind the podium in the White House briefing room. Why is that?
Well, he is indeed. That is because of this so-called caving, and I put speech marks over the word caved there, Andrew, by the White House press secretary, as you say. This is following a backtracking by Mark Carney on a pretty controversial, contentious policy that US President Donald Trump kind of used as a reason to pull out of trade talks with Canada only on Friday. This was a digital services tax that had been sort of discussed in Canada since, I think, 2020, when it was deemed that the US's big tech players who were making money from Canadian users but weren't paying tax from that use, or the custom in Canada, should indeed be paying tax into the Canadian economy. Now, Mark Carney very swiftly backtracked on that, said that the levy was gone, given that those levies, the payment of those, were meant to be starting to come in on Monday, I believe, yesterday, saying that actually kind of this levy is now part of the wider negotiation with President Trump. And I think what's kind of interesting is, since he was elected to the leadership of the Liberal Party, Andrew, as a political outsider, obviously, he has shown himself to be able to act pretty quickly and pretty nimbly. We saw that with this quite controversial consumer carbon tax in Canada, which had been a huge sort of bogeyman for the Conservative Party in Canada, who'd used it against then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau relentlessly. As soon as Carney came into office, he got rid of it straight away. We saw that as well when he hosted the G7 summit as well, kind of, foregoing the traditional communique so that actually the fights over wording wouldn't come to dominate that they could have more constructive conversations on individual topics. So the White House is describing this as a caving in by Mark Carney, but I think many will see it as actually him being a pretty nimble Prime Minister who's pretty keen to sort of get the hurdles out of the way and keep his agenda moving.
Thomas Lewis in Toronto, thank you for joining us. Let's bring our panel back in now, Aliona Hlivco and James Rodgers, and we'll look at Ukraine, where there is good-ish news and possibly less good news. The good news is that Ukraine has finalised an updated trade agreement with the EU. It will replace the temporary framework introduced after Russia's full-scale assault on Ukraine began in 2022 and be something nearer the deep and comprehensive free trade area, which had been operative beforehand. The grimmer tidings are that Russia, or so Russia claims anyway, now holds all of Luhansk Oblast in Ukraine, one of 4 Ukrainian regions Russia believes itself to have annexed nearly 3 years ago. Aliona, first of all, to this question of Luhansk and Russia claiming to hold all of it, you are reasonably well informed that is not quite the case.
Unfortunately, yes. First of all, Ukrainian media is reporting that is not true, that there were still fights reported last night in the Kremenny forest, which is in Luhansk Oblast. So it's not been completely surrendered. But I say unfortunately because that's where my brother's fighting, in that vicinity. And he did say that they're surrounded but not captured just yet.
I mean, how big a deal would it be in the context of the war if Russia was to take all of Luhansk? I mean, there is obviously the wider point that Russia has now been trying for 3.5 years to make any progress in that part of Ukraine and has made very little.
Yes, realistically not very significant in terms of their strategic military objectives, but we have to understand that Russia is using every single move to boost their communications campaign around it and propaganda. So if they manage to capture the totality of Luhansk Oblast and Donetsk, they will actually have the freedom to claim that the 4 regions have been captured. And according to changes to Russian constitution dating a few years back, they now belong to Russian Federation. So that gives them more of an autonomy to claim something, especially during the negotiations with the US.
And just to consider this point from the opposite perspective, James, knowing Russia as well as you do, I mean, Putin will doubtless try to sell this as a great triumph, though his initial plan to conquer Ukraine in 72 hours has fallen some way behind schedule. But will it be seen as such by Russia's people? Because Ukraine at least I'll start that thought again. Going by the estimates of the Ukrainian armed forces, as you know, we recently passed the milestone of 1 million Russian dead and injured. Now, even if that is oversold somewhat by the Ukrainian authorities, it is still the case, surely, that by now Russia's casualties are such that millions of Russians must at least know somebody or know somebody who has been killed or injured.
Yeah, but there's no sign of that having any domestic political effect so far, however. I mean, one thing that we have to remember, and the Ukrainian armed forces themselves have observed this, that, of course, Russia has a much, much, much larger pool of potential soldiery to draw upon, and they've been ruthlessly using that for the last 3 years. And, you know, there's been a number of moves that the Kremlin has taken to try to stifle political dissent. A lot of people, you remember when there was the demobilisation in the fall of 2022, a lot of people were allowed to leave the country who might have been some sort of liberal opposition. So, and remember too that although this has probably taken a bit of a wobble in the last few months, that what Putin has successively done over the last few years is said, well, actually, you know, the reason why we're not going quite so fast is because, as I told you all along, we're not just fighting Ukraine, we're fighting the whole of NATO, and we can see that. And that's, you know, the way that this is being sold domestically. So I don't think there's any sign that people are going to start to turn against him. But yes, you're right. But remember too, the way that this is mythologized, you know, in this twisted way with the Second World War, that this is all part of the sacrifice.
Aliona, if we try to look at the more positive seeming development, this would be the further integration, I guess, of Ukraine and the EU where trade is concerned. Is that going to be seen as a positive signal in Ukraine? Because it is a step towards the European Union, or a step back towards the European Union, probably more accurately.
I would say that it would be an extremely positive step towards the European Union had it not been for the full-scale war that Ukraine is fighting at the moment, because effectively it's all the free trade being stopped now. The tariffs are back on, the EU tariffs. Ukraine will no longer be able to trade with the EU as freely as it used to during the time of war. And we've seen that there's been a lot of protest by the EU member states, and understandably so, because it affects directly their domestic markets. Ukrainian produce is much cheaper. It doesn't always adhere to the standards of the United European Union. So it's a twofold. I guess it's good news for both parties, but Ukraine will now eventually be losing just over $1 billion in profits. And for a country at war with the looming seas of financing from the US and potentially other countries, not such good news for Ukraine.
Well, let's look now at the United States, where as of today, USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, has ceased business. What remains of it folded into the State Department. USAID was a conspicuous casualty of the rampage through the federal government by Elon Musk, sanctioned by President Donald Trump. The agency, founded in 1961 on the watch of President John F. Kennedy, ran humanitarian and development programs all over the world. The idea was always that conspicuously doing good stuff would benefit the US in the long term. A measure of the good stuff USAID was doing may be found in a report by The Lancet, which estimates that USAID's demise may contribute to 14 million avoidable deaths by the end of this decade, a third of them children under 5. James, this would not appear to be one of the great soft power triumphs. Do we hold out any great hope for the mooted successor organisation which will be unsubtly branded America First?
Not necessarily, because I think Marco Rubio, I'm right in saying, himself said that 80% of USAID's activities were going to be stopped. So those which you pointed out are going to be folded into other organisations will be significantly fewer. I actually looked at this Lancet report briefly this afternoon. I mean, it's very sort of thorough in terms of its scientific methodology. I mean, what they've done is basically is work out that figure that you gave of 14 million from the 91 million deaths that they argue that USAID projects have prevented between the period of 2001 to 2021, and that's how they've worked out this is how many could be lost in the future. So, and it's extremely thorough. I have to say my statistical knowledge was and knowledge of statistical methods was stretched as I was reading it, but it's terrifying, really, that sort of figure that they can put so stark, and as I say, it seems methodologically very sound.
Aliona, there has been a thing whereby foreign aid has become decreasingly fashionable among a lot of developed countries. Some, including the United Kingdom, have said that they need to pare back foreign aid because they need to prioritise defence, and possibly there is a case for that. But as regular listeners to this and other Monocle Radio shows will be aware, we're generally big fans of foreign aid, and in fact I would go so far to argue that it's one of the greatest bargains to be found in any public spending anywhere.
I couldn't agree more. Well, firstly, I'm the initial beneficiary of USAID. When I was an exchange student, over 20 years ago, gosh, I'm old, in the United States at the program called Future Leaders Exchange Program. And here I am leading in the world. So I can say that it definitely pays off in terms of bringing new perspectives into people's lives and changing those lives. But I think it's especially unacceptable that the UK has decided to cut international aid budgets so drastically. I'm all for defense. I'm all for supporting Ukraine and boosting defense capabilities for European countries, because we don't know what Russia might do next, or China, or where the conflict in the Middle East will go further. So definitely for boosting defense capabilities, but cutting international aid for that is just not reasonable at all. And that's not just the UK. A lot of European nations also have done the same, cut it by about 1/3, including France and Germany, Switzerland, Denmark. So effectively, the countries that need help the most, they are losing it. And that affects lives, because when it comes back to the UK international aid budget, while the climate finances are ring-fenced, healthcare and education in most vulnerable countries will be stalled. And it may be very soon that we will be facing another pandemic, and who knows whether it's going to be artificial one or a real one coming as a result of this cut of funding.
James, why is international aid always among the first things on the chopping block? Is it just because in terms of domestic politics it's almost always a short-term easy win? You just go out and say, look, we've stopped spending your money on foreigners.
I think there's a big element of that, particularly given the attitude of the current administration in the United States. I mean, I think it's remarkable, and you hinted at this in your introduction to this item, Andrew, the loss of soft power and public sort of, image around the world that the United States is willing to wear for this, perhaps because that's a bit too difficult to explain. But there will also be sort of hard power consequences, if you like, as well, in terms of, regions where there is increasing numbers of disease or drought or whatever else these programs were helping to alleviate are not stable regions, and therefore there's a risk of conflict which may, the United States may decide to engage or not in that. But, we've seen, and we remember when we go back to George W. Bush was saying he wasn't going to involve the United States in wars, and then he involved them in 2 major wars. And a similar thing with Trump getting involved with Iran. I mean, I think in a way there's almost a comparison here with the United States' attitude to NATO, in the sense that, this is the way that it's always been, and it's very, very disruptive not always been, but in recent European history, the United States has been the security guarantor, and it's up to the United States what it wants to decide in terms of foreign policy. But for this change to be introduced so very quickly will be very, very disruptive, and that will not necessarily have good consequences for many nations, including, by the way, the United States.
Well, indeed not, but is also part of the appeal in axing foreign aid, Aliona, that not only do you get to say to your people in the short term, I've stopped spending all your money on foreigners, or even, to be honest, the statistically tiny amount of your money that was being spent on foreign aid programs. And in the long term, if there are dreadful consequences to that, even if they do rebound on your country, you'll be able to say, well, that's not really our fault. It was nothing to do with us.
Well, that's one thing that is very fascinating in British politics ever since I moved to this country 7 years ago, that it's always the predecessor's fault. I keep hearing that with every politician and every new government coming in. I'm afraid we will all have to bear consequences, be it from new health crisis emerging somewhere in the world, or the complete and total loss of soft power that James talked about. Because I think US cutting international aid would be a perfect opportunity for Britain to actually step up and kind of make its own name as a global power that it always aspired to be. Why not start with those projects and supplement even projects in Africa and within Global South? I've recently spoken about this on the panel discussion in Westminster, and I gave a very stark example when Ukraine started fighting war and fighting for its survival, not knowing if it will live to see another day. It started a very concerted campaign in Africa, appointing new ambassadors, talking about how we are not the Europeans that come above you. We were actually colonized by Russia and they now want to exterminate us. So why aren't you on our side? And that soft power, it matters.
Well, to Denmark now, one of those European countries which did not altogether abolish military conscription after the Cold War and now intends to further it. Denmark's constitution, Article 81 thereof to be precise, has long insisted that, quote, every male person able to bear arms shall put in a shift in the nation's defence in line with the laws of the time. That obligation will now be extended to Danish women, who from here on will join Danish men in the draft lottery when they turn 18. The period of mandatory service will also increase from 4 to 11 months, the idea being that by 2033, 6,500 new conscripts will pound the parade ground every year. James, among the other countries which did not let go of conscription or have brought it back are, of course, Finland and Sweden and Norway. Why do the Nordic countries, other than Iceland, which is a bit of a special case, have such a culture of this? Is it something to do with the climate fostering a sort of need for
that's a good question.
Self-reliance, practical skills, that kind of thing?
Yeah, as you know, I've lived in Denmark and I spend quite a lot of time there. I go there on for visits quite often. I mean, I think this is something newer. I mean, as I said in the announcements, because of course, Denmark is very, acutely aware of its geographical location, and also, if it's concern over Russia that's initially prompted this, Denmark too has got concerns over the United States, after all, because the current US administration is talking about seizing the Danish territory of Greenland, whether they like it or not. So Denmark probably, does feel the need to do this. But I think the other thing is, and I remember talking to a Swedish academic colleague about this, in the context of Sweden's joining NATO, and he, like most Swedes, had done his military service, and he said he was convinced that it was a force for good in creating a sense of solidarity in society. And he said you get to meet people that you otherwise might not do. So I suppose that's one argument in favour of it too. And obviously, if a nation is going to face a time of conflict, then that social solidarity, that public morale is very, very valuable. It's going to be interesting to see how this goes because, it is something that, you don't have to do military service in Denmark. As you said, you draw a number, and if your number's up, then you do it. And if not, there are options for doing civil service instead, as there are in many other countries. But it's all been rolled out very, very quickly, this actually, and they weren't sure how quickly the legislation was going to pass because the coalition government system sometimes makes that difficult, but this has gone through very quickly.
Aliona, as a general principle in this day and age, if you're going to conscript people, is it a bit weird not to conscript women as well as men?
I think you definitely need to give them the choice, although we're talking about mandatory conscription. But we've seen in Ukraine that thousands of women volunteered to go fight and were lining up near the conscription offices at the first day of invasion. And there are currently still tens of thousands of women serving actively on the front line, and they're enjoying whatever they're doing, being in medical sphere or snipers or whatever is required of them. So I think in today's day and age, we must give people the freedom to act so, including women. And I even thought back to if the United Kingdom were invaded, as this is now the country where I live, would I go fight? Would I volunteer to join the army? Absolutely, yes.
What are attitudes to conscription in Ukraine now? Have they changed in the last 3 years? Because it's still men only, I think I'm right in saying, between 25 and 60. They lowered it from 27.
Correct. So there was a proposal to get a law into the parliament to have mandatory conscription for women, but I think that was blocked off for now. I must say Ukrainian culture is very protective of women, and they do try to preserve their lives as much as they can. So it's now still voluntary. In terms of men, the conscription age or mobilization has been lowered to 25. They're refusing to lower it to 18. Many Western partners are demanding the lowering of that conscription age because there is a tremendous shortage of troops on the front line, and I hear about it every day. But at the same time, we have to understand that the last 2 years at the very least, when we've seen such a short, intermittent and unreliable supply of ammunition, weapon systems, just everything that military needs on the front line, they most likely think that there's just no point of, filling the gaps with people's lives when there's not enough weapons.
James, just finally on this, is this another straw in the wind where this sort of thing is concerned? Are more European countries going to have to start thinking along these lines? And could it indeed happen here in the United Kingdom? I mean, the Conservative Party did float this during the last election campaign, right. But the Conservative Party were in such a state during that campaign that I think they were at the sort of let's just throw anything at the wall and see what sticks phase.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question. I think the answer to which is probably yes. I mean, I do note that of the things that you can do when you go into the Danish army, because I'd looked this up to practice my Danish, actually. But amongst the things, after the basic training, then conscripts can do different things, amongst which is cyber security. And I think there's a sort of tradition of that. I mean, I was just telling Aliona before we came on the air that when I learnt Russian at university here in the 1980s, the lecturer who was teaching me had learnt Russian when he was doing his national service in the Navy in the 1950s, when they still had it in this country. He'd been studying Latin and Greek at university. When he'd been called up to the army, they said, "You're obviously quite smart at languages, why don't you learn Russian?" So there may be some useful skills for people to learn too.
Well, to Norway now, where many listeners may presently be scrambling to style out the hasty and intemperate expression of various long-suppressed resentments harboured towards employers and spouses. A coding error by Norway's national lottery, Norsk Tipping, led to around 47,000 players thereof being informed that they had scooped potentially transformative sums. Due to a mishap in conversion from euros to kroner, winnings were sensationally multiplied in congratulatory text messages. One bemused recipient informed he'd won a tick over 100 grand, which in Oslo would buy you as many as 3 sandwiches, had to scale his ambitions back upon learning it was nearer a tenner. Aliona, how annoyed would you be, do you think?
Oh my gosh, that would be such a disappointment.
I mean, 10 quid's 10 quid.
10 quid is something. I think the most I've won so far in my life was like £2, and even with that I was happy.
It would be a bit of a psychological roller coaster, I think it's safe to say, James.
It would, I think. I mean, I was reminded that when they've had I remember when the lottery first started here, which was a little over 30 years ago. They didn't have a national lottery before that. There's all these cases of people who think they won, or the people who can't find their ticket. But there was one case which sticks in my mind, which was of a minicab firm where everybody all the cab drivers,
I remember this.
They all thought they'd won a huge amount of money, but it turned out that they said they'd won the lottery, but they'd only matched a certain number of numbers. And so anyway, they all, individually phoned up the boss and told him to get lost, or words to that effect, and said we won't be there on Monday morning or even tomorrow. And then it turned out that they had not won a sort of life-changing sum and had to grovel to get their jobs back afterwards. But I do know I think you were a bit generous in your introduction there, Andrew. It's a coding error. One of the reports I read said a manual coding error, which sounds a wee bit like somebody just got this flat wrong to me.
Yeah. So a promising career in the Norwegian lottery may have come to an abrupt end. Are either of you, Aliona, I'll ask you first, are you a regular lottery ticket purchaser at all?
No, I'm afraid I'm not. As I've said, I think I got 2 tickets in my lifetime, both in the UK, and both times I won £2, and I thought, OK, that's as far as my luck goes. Now go back to work.
James?
Yeah, I do buy lottery tickets sometimes.
Any luck?
Yeah, occasionally. I mean, I'm not going to claim to make a profit or break even, but I do buy tickets well within my means. And interestingly, I don't play the Euro Millions, because that's where the one you can win sort of €100 million, because the honest answer is I would not know what to do with that money.
Well, that's a partial answer to the final question I did want to ask, and I'll ask you each in turn, because Aliona, I did look it up. Tonight's Euro Millions jackpot, and I think if you're quick, you can still get a ticket.
Are you encouraging me?
Possibly.
There's also another Norwegian draw tonight, Andrew. Actually.
If you now go and buy one and you win it, 10%. I think is the least I'm due.
Fair.
£43 million. If you won it, what would you do with it?
Well, I would definitely get myself a home, because that's one thing I'm desperately missing, having my own house or a flat in London, to be modest, and the rest supply my brother with everything he needs on the front line and help as many of my friends who have suffered from the war as I can.
£43 million would that'd cause the Russians a reasonable amount of trouble, I would think.
I would hope so.
James, what would you spend it on?
Well, actually,
bearing in mind that Aliona has pledged all of her winnings to her nation's defence, you can't now say, I want to buy a Ferrari and a jet ski.
No, I don't want to buy a Ferrari or a jet ski. I will stay with the Ukraine theme, because about 2-3 years ago I started a scholarship programme for Ukrainian students whose education had been disrupted by the war, and I've found it a challenging occasionally to raise funds for that, so I put a good lot of my 43 million that way.
God, two insufferably altruistic responses.
You're still getting your 10%.
I would, as you know, I'm very fond of watching football in various parts of Europe. I would treat myself to go and do that a little bit more often, and in a little bit more luxury style, I imagine.
James Rodgers and Aliona Hlivco, thanks for joining us. Finally on today's show, how does a former political advisor in London become one of Amsterdam's favourite adopted sons? For the author and columnist Ben Coates, the answer is totally accidentally. 15 years into life in his new city, Coates has become an invaluable insight into his chosen country and compatriots, publishing books including Why the Dutch Are Different, a journey into the hidden heart of the Netherlands. His latest book, The Invention of Amsterdam, a history of Europe's greatest city in 10 walks, immerses the reader into the canal-laced burg. Monocle's Anita Riota spoke with Ben, and she, as a native New Yorker living in London, began by asking him why he's claimed Amsterdam is one of the best, if not the best, city in the world.
Well, I realise that's probably a provocative claim, not just for New Yorkers, but also for Londoners and Parisians and Berliners and many others. For me, though, I think Amsterdam combines a lot of the things that I would look for in a perfect city. For one thing, it's very small, so it's big enough that there's always something happening, fantastic cultural life of bands and galleries and museums and so on. But you can also walk or cycle the way across the whole centre in just about half an hour, an hour's time. Very safe. The streets are famously kind of pretty much car-free in the city centre. The whole thing has a feeling of this kind of model village, very much set aside for pedestrians and cyclists only. But I think it still has that kind of eccentric buzz that maybe you don't get in some cities like, say, Paris or Venice or something, where it doesn't feel like a complete museum piece just filled with tourists off the cruise ship. But there's also a little bit of seediness there, I suppose, in a fun way, in terms of bars and nightlife and the famous coffee shops where you can smoke whatever you want, and it still has a pretty lively, eccentric side too.
So your book, The Invention of Amsterdam, unpacks the city and its history by taking readers on scenic walks through the city. What about the physical landscape of Amsterdam makes it such a great place to live in your eyes?
Well, the most famous thing about Amsterdam is probably the canals. It has, by some measures, more canals than Venice, hundreds of bridges, as I said, largely car-free, and these famous kind of streetscapes of where you have the curving canals and the beautiful old townhouses along them, and then the murky water and the canal boats in front of those is famously very beautiful. And I think that's a large part of the charm of this place, is that it often feels pretty much completely unchanged in the last 300 or 400 years. You have the feeling that if you walk along the Herengracht to get lunch today, you could almost bump into Rembrandt walking around the corner with an easel under his arm. But I'm also interested in the fact that outside of the city centre, it's quite different from that, of course. I sometimes feel that foreign writers or journalists give this slightly fantastical view of Amsterdam as being a completely liberal, peaceful paradise where there's nothing but bicycles and bridges and canals and tulips, when actually I think, like any significant city, there's also some bad things and some less glamorous places where ordinary Amsterdammers live and work in buildings that perhaps aren't beautiful, and there are problems maybe with crime and pollution and with house prices rising and gentrification and with too many tourists pushing up prices and so on. So I was quite keen to explore some of those slightly neglected issues behind the scenes as well.
Do you have a favorite walk that you went on for the book?
My favourite one probably actually was starting outside the city. There's a small town to the south of Amsterdam, I suppose about 10 miles south of the city, which is called Oudekerk aan de Amstel. Fairly typical small Dutch town, but it's connected directly by the river Amstel to the heart of Amsterdam. And in one of the chapters of the book, I walk along that river all the way from Oudekerk into Amsterdam, following in the footsteps of Rembrandt, who lived in the area and often did a similar walk himself, painting and sketching along the way. And I think that's a really nice way to see the city, because you get to see the old city centre and all the traditional highlights in the middle, but you also get to approach it from a slightly different angle and see the city looming on the horizon and getting closer and closer as you walk across those flat green fields and past the windmills and past the farms with the thatched roofs until the city gets closer.
Now, I want to ask you about your newfound compatriots. Can you tell me a bit about your first impression of the Dutch, and what have you come to love about them?
Well, I think my first impression, probably like many people's first impression actually, is that they're a very friendly, welcoming lot. A lot of people speak English. They're very used to having people of other nationalities come and go here. And I think the culture is very sort of open and egalitarian, and people are always willing to stop and have a chat. And I think even after nearly 15 years here, that's still actually the thing I value most, is that sort of unpretentiousness, where people will cycle to work in a pair of jeans. I was saying to someone this morning, actually, I don't think I've seen someone wearing a suit in Amsterdam for at least the last 2 months. It's just almost unheard of. Everything's quite relaxed. People do work hard and they get lots done. The quality of life is extremely high. Incomes are extremely high, but there's this sort of laid backness to it, which I don't think you get in other cities of a similar standard.
Finally, Amsterdam will celebrate its 750th birthday with massive celebrations planned. If any of our listeners are planning on joining the festivities, what would you recommend for them to do while they're there?
For me, my favourite thing to do if the weather's nice is closer to the city centre. You have, next to the Maritime Museum, there's a nice harbour called the Marineterrein. And it's a lovely place to swim in the water there. It's just about clean enough to swim without getting sick these days. And you get this spectacular view across the water to this old Dutch sort of sailing galleon. It looks like a pirate ship from Pirates of the Caribbean or something on the river. And you can swim amongst the old buildings and then clamber out and have a cold beer in the sunshine next to a canal somewhere. I think that's probably where you'll find me.
That was Ben Coates speaking to Monocle's Anita Riota. The Invention of Amsterdam is in bookstores now. And that is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Aliona, Hlivco and James Rodgers, also to Thomas Lewis. Today's show was produced by Carlotta Rebello and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.